Hey everyone, welcome to Singularity Computers Client Build 14 Part 3. In this part of the build log, I'm going to focus on completing the water cooling loops and filling them. I'm going to start this video with some minor case mods. I need to run tubing from the central compartment to and from the upper and lower compartments. I also need to modify the upper 560mm radiator mount so that it fits properly. So there's a number of openings through the upper and lower dividing panels. For the 5.25 inch bays, also for mounting fans and potentially radiators. There are cover panels for all of these openings, which you can see here. And it turns out I don't need to route the tubing through the main case panels because the tubing happens to line up with the cover panels. So I need to modify these cover panels. I need to make some holes through them for the tubing, and I also still need to paint them. You might have noticed that where I've routed the fan wiring, it's not actually going to fit because there is no gap underneath the radiator. So I need to change the routing for the fan wiring, and I'm going to route it around the front of the radiator. I'm going to do the same thing in the upper and lower compartments. Before I can do any of this, I need to remove all of the components from the upper and lower compartments. So I've now removed the fans, radiators, and power supplies, and you can see that I've completed the modifications for the cover panels and I've reinstalled them. So there is 4 holes altogether in the cover panels. I've also painted them in the same metallic charcoal I've used throughout the build, and I now need to move on to the mods to the 560mm radiator mount at the top of the build. And there's a couple of things I need to do. I need to grind off a section at the top of the mount so that it fits underneath the top panel of the case. And I also need to do something about these 3 screws, which happen to be right underneath where the radiator mount needs to sit, and they're actually completely in the way. And I want to modify the radiator mount so that these screws are still accessible. I've now progressed with a number of different aspects of the build. You can see that I've reinstalled all of the components into the top and bottom compartments. I've also completed the mods for the upper 560mm radiator mount. And for anybody thinking of going with this particular radiator configuration in this case, this is definitely a great way of doing things. I've drilled the 3 holes at a 45-degree angle through the corner of the mount, and it means that the screws are accessible so that even with the mount, the fans, and the radiator installed, you can still remove the cover panel from underneath. And I've also ground off approximately 5mm at the top of the mount on either side, so it now fits perfectly underneath the top panel of the case. And you may or may not have to do this part of it. It just depends on the slight variations between the different cases and mounts. I found that the first time I assembled this case, I actually got it to fit, but it was a very tight fit, so I prefer to modify the panel because I've actually assembled and disassembled this case a couple of times now. You might have noticed that I've changed the configuration on the motherboard area. I've changed the tubing routing between the water blocks. And there's a couple of reasons I did this. One is because I didn't really like the angles in the previous config. It didn't really suit the build. I much prefer this config. And I also wanted the opening, the outlet from the configuration, to be on the memory water block on the left-hand side at the top of it, just so that the loop is a little bit cleaner. You can also see that I've started installing fittings. And the build is now up to the point where I can actually start installing the tubing. You can see that I've installed the drainage systems, and it turns out one of these drainage systems is going to work really well. For the CPU motherboard and memory loop, the radiator is at the top of the build, so it means that this drainage system is at the lowest point. But for the graphics loop, the radiator is below, so the drainage system is up fairly high in the loop. So it's not going to drain all of the coolant, but I obviously installed both of the drainage systems in this position to match. You can never really completely empty a loop anyway, which means you need to flush it. So when the drainage system is not at the lowest point, it just means you need to flush the loop a little bit more. Looking around the back of the build, you can see that I've installed the SSDs in the SSD cage. I've also started on the custom wiring and cable management back here. And at this point, I've actually completed all of the custom wiring, but there is still a lot of custom wiring I still need to install. The only custom wiring left to do is actually the wiring for the lighting, and the lighting is always the very last thing I do. So I've re-sleeved the wiring for the power and reset buttons. I've done the wiring for the pumps, so I've customized the wiring to length, I've sleeved it, I've crimped new pins on, put new connectors on. So all of the wiring is prepared and ready to go. You can also see that I've done the wiring for the fans, both in the top and bottom compartments. And what I've done here, I've customized the wiring to length, and I'm using Mod My Toys 5-way 3-pin fan splitters to Molex. And I use these a lot in my builds because most of the time I'm using 1200 RPM fans or less. So the fans are very quiet. There's no need to have the ability to turn them down any further because it's not really going to make any difference to noise output, but it is going to impact on performance. So with fans that are 1200 RPM or less, there's really no need for any form of fan control. The only time I'll go for any form of fan control, whether it's manual or automatic, preferably automatic, something like the Aquero where you can set up fan curves, is when I'm using fans that are 1500 RPM or more. It is good to have higher RPM fans in certain situations. If you want to get the maximum out of your water cooling loop, it is nice to have that headroom there when overclocking and benchmarking. But if you can get the necessary radiator capacity, then 1200 RPM fans are more than enough, particularly if they're premium fans. I've mentioned previously that I have somebody employed who does some of my custom wiring. The way we do things, he actually does the wiring for the core components. So what I mean by this is the 24 pin, the PCIe and the EPS, and then I usually do the rest. And we do things a little bit differently. We do all of our wiring from scratch, except for maybe a few fan wires here and there. Everything has been built from the ground up with high quality 16 gauge wire for the core components. Pins are crimped on, new connectors, everything's sleeved. And something else that we often do is actually rearrange and redesign some of the cables to clean them up. For example, where there's 2 wires in one pin, we always solder. And something else that is actually possible, something else we do, is rearrange the 24 pin wires. If they're often an absolute mess. So if you have a good long look at the 24 pin cable and have a think about it, you can actually swap around some of the wires to improve the look of the cable, make it a little bit less tangled. So this is something that we often try to do. Now you can see that I have 4 other cables here. There is 1 each for each of the splitters, so Molex cables straight from the power supply. I also have one here for the SSDs and another one for the pumps. I'm now going to start tubing up. EK was the first to release a 16mm acrylic tube system, which I've used a couple of times in my builds now. 16mm is currently the largest acrylic tube system size available. BitsPower has also now released a range of 16mm fittings, including the multi-link enhanced fittings which I'm using in this build. But they didn't immediately release 16mm acrylic tube, so I was actually going to use EK's 16mm acrylic in this build, but it turns out it doesn't fit in BitsPower's fittings, in particular the 16mm multi-link enhanced fittings. And it doesn't fit by a long way, even when I sanded a lot off the end of the tube to the point of there being a step in the tube. I still had trouble getting it to fit, and the tube was just starting to look ugly, so I decided not to use it. And for this build, I decided to wait for BitsPower to release their 16mm acrylic tube, and they've now released it in a whole range of different sizes, all the way up to 1 meter. And they've also done this for their 12mm acrylic tube. So this is going to be great for people who don't want to have to cut their tubing, because there is just so many sizes available from BitsPower. I've now completed both of the water cooling loops. Now, this build is a good example of how the different acrylic tube diameters can be used. When choosing your acrylic tube or hard tube diameter, there is two main things to be considered: aesthetics and performance. You can see that on the motherboard area where the components are very close together, I've used 12mm acrylic tube, because if I were to use a larger diameter tube there, things would start to look very cramped. I mean, they're already fairly cramped, so I don't want to, make things any worse. And a large diameter tube can also be very difficult to install between components that are close together. Then throughout the rest of the build, where the long lengths are and there's a lot of space, I've used the 16mm acrylic tube. So this also goes for different sized builds. You'll notice that in my small form factor builds, I always like to use 12mm acrylic tube, and then in larger builds, I like to use 16mm acrylic tube. So that's the aesthetics side of things. The performance side of things works out well for the aesthetics, because the longer your loop is, the more of an impact the diameter of the tube is going to have on performance. So I've used fittings for the bends in this build, and that was actually by client request, but that is something I would personally have chosen to do in this particular build, because I don't prefer using fittings for the bends or bending the acrylic tube either way. I just prefer whatever is going to suit the build best. And if you take a look at the fittings I've used for the bends, it's a 90-degree fitting in combination with the 16mm multi-link enhanced fittings. And this is the first time I've used this fitting configuration, so I was concerned that the 90-degree fitting was going to look too small for the rest of the configuration. But it turns out that's not really a problem. It's worked out fairly well. Now, I've found that even the BitsPower 16mm acrylic tube is still a very tight fit in the 16mm multi-link enhanced fittings. So a way that you can improve this a little bit is by rounding off a bit more of the end of the tube than you probably normally would. So I like to round it off to about 3mm back from the end and take off about 1/3 of the thickness of the tube. Now, something I see a lot in almost every build where people go for horizontal, vertical and 90-degree angles with their tubing, like I have in this build, is angles that are off. And even if they're off just a little bit, it's so easy to see. It's something that most people are going to be looking for, and just about anybody can pick it up. And sometimes it's really hard to see if the tubing is on an incorrect angle. Sometimes you don't notice it until later, until after you've filled the loop. And when you're bending acrylic tube, it's even more difficult because there's so many more things to think about. So I like to use a small level of some sort. This spirit level is definitely not ideal. It's a bit too big. But, even if it's just for peace of mind. It's now time for me to fill the loops. The client has requested that I try 2 different sets of coolant colors in this build. First of all, I'm going to be filling the loops with Mayhem's X1 UV Green in combination with Mayhem's X1 Clear UV Blue, and then with Mayhem's Pastel Green in combination with Mayhem's Pastel Black. I'm going to be mixing both of the greens myself with Mayhem's dyes. Now, the UV green, there's no way I'm going to be able to get it to match with the color of the custom paint, because as you can see here, it's a very vibrant fluoro color, and particularly in combination with UV lighting, it obviously looks like it has its own light source. It becomes glow in the dark or iridescent, and it's just more of an acid green or alien green. And even if I added a lot of blue and tried to keep it very diluted, it just still wouldn't look like the color of the custom paint. So that's not really the intention with the UV coolants. It's more just to go with something that's going to stick out a little bit more, be a bit more individual, and kind of be a bit different from everything else that I've done with this build so far, which has been more subtle and elegant. But then the pastel coolants is obviously to match the colors of the custom paint, and I'm going to mix up the pastel green so that it matches the color of the paint. I should be able to get it so that it almost matches it perfectly. Now, I remember a time when UV green was overused, just like black and red, and people ended up with that same kind of attitude towards it. And it was actually because of that that I stopped using UV green, and I haven't used it since. I did use it for a very short time in a testbed build that I did, but other than that, this is the first time I've used it in probably 6 or 7 years. So it has been a long time. And not that I don't like the color, I absolutely love a good UV green with some good UV lighting. There is nothing like the glow of UV green. It seems to create a better UV effect than any of the other coolants. And particularly when it fits a theme, it just looks amazing. And I think in this build, it's going to clash a little bit. I mean, you can already see that happening. It's clashing with the green of the custom paint, but that's going to not look anywhere near as bad. You need to keep in mind that the reason the green looks a little bit muddy at the moment is because of all of the air in the loop. Once the air comes out of the loop, it will look a lot more like it did when I was mixing it before, more of a fluoro color. And it's that bright, vibrant color that really comes out in it once there's UV lighting. So I think once both of the coolants are glowing brightly, the background will just kind of fade and blend in. And, you know, that's what I'm hoping for here. The green won't clash so much. But that's only if the client actually decides to stick with these coolant colors. Otherwise, we'll be going with the pastel colors, which I think will actually suit this build a lot more, considering the clean, elegant aesthetics. I think it's probably the better way to go. So I'm now just starting the pump for the first time on the second loop, and while I'm filling the second loop, I'm actually leak testing the first loop. The external power supply that I have, I've hooked up a splitter to it, and it can easily handle a couple of pumps and more. So often I use the splitter for running multiple pumps, you know, testing fans, lighting, and other things. It's very useful to have a small external power supply. And for me, I have multiple work areas, so you know, I often carry it around to the different work areas to test different things. So both loops are now full, and the leak testing is not quite complete. You can see there's still a fair bit of air in both of the loops. Actually, the green still has that kind of muddy color. I'm just going to do a brief test with UV lighting to get an idea of what the loops could look like if the client does decide to go with these coolants. Keep in mind that once all of the UV lighting is installed, and usually I do a fair bit of experimentation with the positioning of my lighting to get the best possible positioning, the UV effect is going to be vastly improved compared to this. But I think you can see what I mean. Once the coolants are glowing, you know, the colors of the custom paint just kind of blends into the background. It's not so important that the greens clash. But that's it for this part of the build log. In the next part of the build log, I'm going to change the coolant over to the pastel coolants. I'm going to focus on taking a good look around the finished product, and I'm also going to include the test results. That sums up this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like, and favorite if you want to see more.